Um, Today we're going to go through just the basic overview of the plan, and want people to be familiar with it, understand what it is, why it was developed, and what it can be used for in the future. All right, so the Twin Cedars area is the Cedar Creek watershed is about 32,700 acres. This represents the smaller portion of the larger Cedar Creek watershed, which drains into the Des Moines River, and is an area with quite a bit of diverse landscapes, both crops, timber, pasture areas, as well as several areas of public land as well. And as I mentioned, this is in the Des Moines River Basin. You can see that outline of the watershed that extends all the way up into southern Minnesota, includes the Des Moines, Boone, and Raccoon rivers further in north central Iowa, as well as several other river watersheds in the southern and central part of the state. You can see that small orange area is the Twin Cedars watershed. That's the 32,000 acre area we're talking about today, which is a part of Cedar Creek, which drains into the Des Moines River just into Mahaska County, and it's part of the lower Des Moines subbasin, which stretches from Marion, Mahaska County all the way down to the very southeastern tip of the state of Iowa. So watershed planning is a process where we evaluate the area, both in terms of geography, geology, as well as social and other considerations. So this is kind of the basic or general overview of the stages to implement a watershed plan. We go from watershed characterization, that's more of the physical presence of the geographic and geologic features. We look for involvement from the people who live there and get an idea of what type of conservation, what type of practices they might be interested in, what their resource concerns are. Develop goals, evaluate different approaches for meeting those goals, acquire resources to implement the program. So we're somewhere between those two. We're at the setting of goals, and the watershed plan can be used to fund implementation of those goals. And then beyond this would be implementation, and then also reevaluation and monitoring of the actions taken to improve the watershed. So as part of this process, beginning was well over a year ago, we had some meetings with the WMA to get some feedback from different stakeholders about the resource concerns they had. You can see that on the left, and then what improvements could be made. And so trying to identify where people's heads were at in terms of what they think was reasonable and what they think the goal should be. So to get those goals that we summarized were to improve water quality. That's obviously the main focus of any watershed plan in this context. Build soil health. We know that's a pretty general goal, but we know that improving infiltration, improving ground cover, things of that nature will improve the soil over the long term. We want this to be a useful tool in pursuing and securing conservation funding. So all the practices we describe in the next few slides need to be funded. Want it to reduce flooding. So this area has a lot of relief in the landscape and has a high potential for runoff and erosion. So we need to focus on practices that do both reduce nutrient losses, but also reduce flooding. And then also provide information about practices, resources, and assistance. So we are at the stage of providing information about the practices. Resources and assistance could be pursued later to help implement those practices. So looking at the watershed, some of the geographic features here. It's a terrain analysis. There's about almost 300 feet of relief from the very top of the watershed down to the bottom. So it's an area with a lot of slopes and hills, as anyone who's been there knows, along with several areas of very flat ground in the floodplain at the bottom of the watershed. Along with that, along with those high amounts of relief, comes quite a few areas that have a lot of slopes. So greater than 5%. There's a lot of steep slopes in the watershed. It's pretty obvious from the breakup of the landscape where crops are grown and also where timber and pasture predominate. But there's quite a bit of slopes, which are classified as highly erodible. So these are soils that if they are exposed to water, you're going to have a high potential for water erosion. If the soil is left bare, and if infiltration and aggregate stability are not a focus of the land management practices. And just to build on that, soil erosion risk varies throughout the watershed. So looking at this, we have areas that are severe risk of erosion. Many of these are embedded within crop fields. Many of them have been set aside in CRP or are edge of field areas that might be in pasture or timber. But we have quite a range of the erosion risk throughout the watershed, and of course, this does not. This is a general erosion risk map, so we recognize that those land management activities, whether it's tillage, no-till, rotation, and type of vegetation, are going to affect that risk. But some areas are just prone to erosion if not kept covered. And soil productivity is highly variable. So there's areas in the southern part of the watershed and some of the areas in that transition between upland and bottom ground areas where the slope is very steep. There's a lot of exposed paleosols, so really old soils that are not as productive, do not have high organic matter levels, and are likely to not produce as good of crops. As a reflection of that, the ground or the land use map here reflects that. So about half of the acres in the watershed are in corn and soybean production. Another 25% approximately are in grasses and pasture, with the balance in timber, developed areas, and other land uses. So it's predominantly agricultural. It's not as high a percentage of cropland acres as some other parts of the state, but it is still there's still quite a bit of cropland managed within the watershed, which is the main focus of most of the conservation practices that are included in the watershed plan. One other concern here is source water protection. This watershed is upstream of several different source water users. So I know the city of Ottumwa, as well as other small towns, draw water from these areas. And what this map shows is the buffered stream areas to show that areas near or closer to the stream are likely to have water going down to the groundwater and are going to be recharging those source water wells more likely than some of the upland areas that are more likely to run off and are less likely to end up in groundwater that might be used as source water. So there is a source water issue or concern here, but it is mainly focused on some of those areas adjacent to the streams. And there's also quite a bit of conservation work that's already been done over time in this watershed. So we did an evaluation of the watershed, and there's quite a bit of no-till, not a lot of acres of true, I guess, cover crops on crop ground, but a lot of structural practices. So in this part of the state, is structural practices have been the focus of conservation work to date, and have been focused on reducing soil erosion and reducing delivery of sediment to streams. So that's why we have a lot of the ponds, terraces, sediment basins, grass waterways, which are all over the watershed and are used in the majority of crop fields in some manner. And there's also about 10%, or between 5 and 10% of the total watershed that's in CRP. So there's quite a bit of ground that is crop ground, but is ceded to a permanent conservation type cover. But progress has been made, and there's been a lot of investment in conservation practices in this watershed to date. And this is a map of those. This is how they're distributed around the watershed. And so this is a pretty busy map, and it's hard to drill down and see in any particular field what's going on there. But it just goes to show that water and sediment basins, terraces, and ponds are scattered all over this watershed and are significant features on the landscape. So when we talk about focusing on water quality, there's three main metrics that we've chosen to look at here: soil erosion, phosphorus, and nitrate loss. These goals are based on the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, for lack of a more site-specific goal or target. But what this is showing here is that the history of soil erosion and sediment reduction practices has really led to a noticeable and visible reduction in soil erosion losses from the landscape. Not that can't be improved, but it's not something that is as bad as it was before. And along with that, with reductions in soil erosion and soil sediment leaving the fields, that's the predominant loss pathway for phosphorus. And so there's not as big of a phosphorus loss concern in the watershed. Now, where the metric that needs improvement, or this watershed plan focuses on, is on the nitrate losses. So corn and soybean crop ground are prone to losses inherently, and there are strategies and there are practices that can reduce that. And so that's where the majority of the practices are focused within the watershed plan. And some practices are considered more likely to be broadly adopted. So this is kind of an obvious statement, but we know that based on history of people focusing on sediment reduction, losses, and erosion reduction, it's different than looking at nutrient losses. And so this is how we did that, using that prioritization and the likelihood of adoption. We put together this matrix for this watershed based on feedback that was received at the meetings that we held over the last few years, and are looking at practices that have the most impact on nitrate loss reduction, and then also the likelihood or the sense of the people who are in the watershed that likelihood that practice would be implemented. And so we have practices like wetlands, extended rotations, that have a large impact on reducing nitrate losses, but are less likely to be implemented than, say, something like pond, which people really like to put in and are likely to install, but do not have a great impact on water quality relative to some of the other practices. So it's just kind of a exercise to put to compare a practice to how likely it would be to be implemented. So with all this information, we developed a conceptual plan for practice implementation. And so taking the goals that are outlined in the nutrient reduction strategy, both the nitrate losses as well as the phosphorus and soil erosion reductions that would come along with that. We're looking at these practices for potential implementation in the future. So this would be nitrogen management would be getting all corn acres to using the maximum return to nitrogen rate on 75% of the acres. No-till being used on all soybean acres and half of the corn acres. Again, cover crops on all soybean acres or all acres prior to soybean, as well as 25% of acres going to corn. And those are the main infield practices that people can use. So have to do directly with crop management. Other than extended rotation, we didn't identify a goal number of acres, but recognize that that can be a tool that, if the economics are available for people to use, whether that's with extended rotations and needing hay crops or places to spread manure, then extended rotations can be very profitable. But they also have an effect on nitrogen losses. So they're a practice that can be included, but we have not identified them based on an acre target in this current version of the watershed plan. And then we get into some of the structural practices. So farm ponds, saturated buffers, and bioreactors, these are practices that are going to reduce nitrate losses at the edge of the field or in the stream, along with wetlands that are larger impoundments within stream channels that both hold water to reduce the nitrate load within it, as well as can provide flood control benefits if engineered to store water for surge events after rain occurs. And then both the terraces and stream buffers, those are practices that we don't have a particular goal within the plan, but recognize that they should be used where appropriate. And this is what that practice or these practices look like on the map. So going from adding the additional structural practices, the terraces, the sediment basins, and then also the cropland having both no-till and cover crop implemented, as well as the location of larger drainage area or larger wetlands that are servicing larger drainage areas upstream from them. And so this is developed based on a geographic information system model that can identify where practices are likely to be possible to be placed. So you can't put a wetland everywhere, you can't put a pond anywhere, but you can evaluate the landscape using elevation data, soils data, et cetera, to identify where practices are most likely. And that's how we were able to arrive at some of those numbers to determine how many potential sites were realistic, and also get an idea of a starting point for where they could be installed in the landscape. And so this information we have in greater detail. If people are interested in viewing it, it's within the watershed plan document that's available both electronically, and if people are interested, we can get them a copy. So to keep this plan in context of, it costs money, and we recognize that significant resources would be needed to implement the watershed plan. And so to implement the infield practices based on current cost share rates that are paid through EQIP, would require about a $343,000 annual budget, and this would be to pay people to implement the infield practices. And and to implement every single one of the structural practices that was identified in the watershed plan would require about $4.25 million, a little over $4.25 million. So recognize that this is over a long-term time span. So we're looking at 20 years approximately of implementation time it would take to do everything on this. And so stretching that amount over time is a little, or stretching that amount of money over a larger period of time does make it seem less of a high value. But it does require significant input. And some context that we think is relevant to scoping out how much money would be required is that just taking the average yields of corn soybean acres within the watershed, and there's about a $10.5 million gross revenue occurring from the crops that are sold within the watershed. Just on average, you taking the average price received and the average yields. And so this represents a little over 3% of the total annual budget. There's also a huge farmland asset value within the watershed. So about $111 million of land assets within the watershed. And so if we look at $4.25 million for structural practices, that equates to about 3.5 to 4% of the total value. So just trying to provide some context. So I know those numbers seem rather large, but also recognizing that if the investments are made in the land and the assets are used to reinvest in the land for these purposes, that it's possible to improve water quality. So the next steps, I want to mention that there's still an opportunity for farm conservation assessments as part of this project. And what we would do is connect with you to identify the fields that you have control over, and kind of zoom in on the structural practices that are possible through the model that identified where those could fit, and then also discuss some potential land management scenarios or practices that might be possible on your land. So we're trying to bring the larger watershed plan down to a more field scale, farm scale level. So if people are interested in that, they can contact me, and I'd be happy to discuss that with them. If people would like to review the plan, we have it available as a digital version and a PDF. And if people really want one, we could definitely print one and provide it to you. Just make sure to contact us, and we can work that out. This will be posted on our website at some point, and the information is publicly available because we want this to be a resource for people to use in the future. And so the main use of this watershed plan is that it outlines the possible practices and helps prioritize which ones would be worth pursuing for when funding opportunities come up. So whether this would be state WQI, there's federal programs that invest in watershed improvement. The first step in acquiring those is often having a plan. And so this provides an outline for any future watershed level work, and that would be done and focused on conservation practices. So that's the purpose of this, and why we went through the exercise of creating it. So I appreciate your time. Be happy to entertain any questions that people have. And if they don't want to ask them now, they can feel free to contact me. My email address is listed there, and that is my office phone number. And I encourage anyone who has any questions to give me a call at your convenience, and I would be happy to tell you anything I know. Thank you for attending today, and if we have any questions, I'll take them now. Otherwise, have a great day, and thank you for listening.